Thank you so much for tuning into the Psychology Is podcast. I'm Nick Fortino, and I'm very fortunate today to have this guest, Dr. Scott Bonn. Thank you so much for joining me, Scott.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, so I'll give a little introduction here and set the table for what we're going to talk about. So I'll mention that up front. What we're going to talk about is essentially why people are so fascinated with serial killers. And I was just kind of reflecting on the various topics that we cover on this podcast and in the videos we make on this channel. And the spectrum is growing wider. And it's funny because today I'm talking to you about this, and then in a few days, I'm talking to an expert on why babies laugh. So it gives you a sense of the variety of topics we cover here.
Pretty broad range there.
Indeed. So let me give a little introduction, and then you can add any detail you like. Dr. Scott Bonn is a criminologist and professor and former media executive. I understand you were a former vice president at NBC.
That's correct.
Okay. And you're an author of a couple books, including one called Mass Deception, Moral Panic in the U.S. War on Iraq, and also Why We Love Serial Killers, the curious appeal of the world's most savage murderers. And it's the insight in this book here about serial killers that motivated me to contact you, and it's what this conversation will be about. So it seems to me that you are uniquely equipped by your education and your work experience and all of your research to speak on this topic, particularly involvement at NBC. You kind of saw from the inside what motivates the types of stories that are shared on these media outlets. So let's dive in. I'll say one more thing. So I also teach psychology. I'm a professor of psychology, and in the very first class, we talk about how psychology is very much about the question, why do we do what we do? And why do we feel what we feel? And why do we think what we think? And so I often do an exercise with my students where I ask them to write down a few questions that start with, why do people? And then also a few questions that start with, why do I? And almost invariably, over the many years I've been teaching now, someone comes up with the question, why do people murder? Or sometimes even, why am I so interested in psychopaths? Or why do I love crime shows so much? So it's a very common theme among people to have this fascination that you talk about. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you noticed that too.
Absolutely.
So perhaps you can just say in a simple way up front before we delve into the details, why are we so fascinated in serial killers?
Well, great question. And it is it's the premise of the book. In many ways, it arose from my own students' interest in this phenomenon, in serial killers specifically, that led me to write the book, Why We Love Serial Killers. What I noticed is when I was teaching criminology classes, anytime the term serial killer came up, my students immediately moved forward in their chairs. Their eyes got wider and they became riveted in every word that I was saying. And I said, there's something going on here. And I too share a fascination. And I think the fascination with serial killers is in many ways a microcosm of our broader interest in things that are larger than life, frightening, exotic, and rare. In fact, if you think about the great white shark, thanks to the Discovery Network, we celebrate a Shark Week. Well, I wouldn't be surprised, given the incredible popularity of Investigation Discovery Channel and Oxygen and HLN and other networks, A&E, that we may one day have a serial killer week. We may celebrate a serial killer week because of this. And I think that to a certain extent, it's human nature. We're drawn to these larger than life dangerous things. And I actually use the analogy that serial killers in many ways are like great white sharks. What do they have in common? They're rare, they're exotic, and they're very deadly.
Mm,
And the media portrays them in these larger than life, fashion.
mm,
And as a result, people believe consistently that serial killers are responsible for far more murders in the United States than is really the case. Serial killers are never responsible for more than perhaps 1% of all the
mm,
homicides in the United States, but they get an undue amount, the lion's share of attention. And as a result, the public perception is that maybe they're responsible for 25% or
mm,
50% of all the murders out there.
mm,
So it's my fascination really started with my own experience in the communications field. You mentioned my time at NBC. What I noticed there, and it's an old journalistic term that if it bleeds, it leads. The more sensationalized, the more gory often a story, the more people tune in. Well, serial killers are sort of at the apex of that,
mm,
the epitome of that, and as such, they are sort of become in our pop culture the ultimate poster boys, boogeymen, the ultimate personification of evil. So
mm.
to answer your question, that's a long-winded way of saying that serial killers, I believe, are a specific observation within this larger fascination with all things that are dangerous.
Mm.
People are interested. People chase storms. People chase hurricanes. People chase tornadoes. People are interested in tsunamis, avalanches, things that are just larger than life and dangerous.
Mm. And actually, I wouldn't even classify that as long-winded. I just think you answered that in an incredibly direct, clear way. So
Oh,
thank
thank you.
you. Thank you for that. And I love the comparison to a great white shark. Yeah, they're rare, they're exotic, and they're dangerous, they're deadly, just like serial killers. That's fascinating. So the larger than life piece of this, in your book, you talk a lot about how that is, in a way, manufactured by media. And you just spoke to this as well. And I wanted to read a quote right from the beginning of your book. The crime news story, you say, is an entertainment product, just like an episode of CSI or Criminal Minds. Sensationalized and graphic entertainment news generates large network television audiences, and major advertisers are willing to pay handsomely to present their commercials to those audiences. Therefore, you say, it is in the best financial interests of network television producers to make their crime news stories as shocking and enticing as possible to viewers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very interesting, and in a sense it almost makes me feel duped, I suppose, into paying attention to this perhaps even more than it merits. Like you said, I would have guessed a much higher number than 1% when it comes to the number of murders serial killers account for. And it does create this definitely larger than life celebrity level status for them. I recently watched that documentary, maybe you saw it too, on Netflix, about Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. I imagine many listeners have seen it as well. It's quite popular. And one of the things that stood out to me was not just the celebrity status, but some degree of sex appeal. When he
Mm-hmm.
was in jail, women were just sending him nude pictures and writing him love letters and things like this. And I don't think it was because he was particularly a handsome man, maybe to some degree, but I think it was more so the larger than life celebrity status.
Yes.
So what do you think? Is there something in us that, I mean, clearly there is something in the masses of people that is kind of susceptible to this type of manipulation? Like, what makes us prone to accepting or perceiving things in this larger than life way?
Great question. And you just mentioned the groupie phenomenon. In fact, Richard Ramirez, you may know, married one of his groupies, who in
Mhm.
fact was a journalist. So I don't know what the I don't know what the moral of the story there is, but she wrote him something like 1,000 letters, and ultimately they became married.
I didn't
And
know that.
yeah, and in a truth being stranger than fiction. There's a whole phenomenon out there of collecting what's known as murderabilia, which these are really obsessed individuals that want to hold and touch and collect things that were once held or owned or even created by the likes of Bundy and Gacy and Richard Ramirez. He's one of the most collectible. So people will actually pay big money for things that a shirt that was once worn by Richard Ramirez, for example, and now, believe it or not, his widow, because Richard Ramirez died in prison a couple of years ago of liver failure, his widow authenticates his murderabilia. So if you buy a shirt that was once worn by Richard Ramirez, you get a little note signed by his widow saying this, in fact, was once owned by my dead husband. So you can't make this stuff up, So that's sort of the extreme of this phenomenon of the fascination with serial killers. The groupies. That could be almost a discussion unto itself. Mm-hmm. But to get back to your question at hand, there's multiple things happening here simultaneously from a psychological standpoint and a sociological standpoint, I would argue. It's interesting because you're trained in psychology. My training is actually in sociology. Mm-hmm. So I look at crime as a phenomenon across society mm-hmm. and the various social forces that impact crime and impact the motivations to create crime. But I'm also fascinated by the overlap of those two, the area of social psychology, where the two, the nexus where the two come together, I think is ultimately fascinating. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, in many ways what we're probably going to be talking about here today. But some of these phenomenon that are at play here that create this fascination and this appeal are actually contradictory in nature, I believe. So I'll sort of walk through this. At the one hand, someone like a Bundy or a Ramirez is so extreme in what they do that it shocks us. It baffles us. We simply can't comprehend how someone could take a complete stranger, in most cases, abduct them, take them somewhere, torture them, perhaps sexually assault them, kill them, in some cases have post-mortem sex with them, in extreme cases even cannibalize them, like Jeffrey Dahmer. It just blows our mind that people could do something like that. Mm. So it creates fear. And so at a certain level, we need to understand in a way to reduce that fear. If we can somehow wrap our mind around it, if we can somehow define it and put parameters around it, and we can say, okay, I understand it now. At a visceral level, it's not so scary. At least I get it. I comprehend it. But the problem is, some of it is so incomprehensible that it's almost impossible to wrap our minds around it. Mm. And that's where the media comes into play. And they use these reductionistic terms like monster, vampire, evil, that are just shorthand ways, lazy ways of putting a label on this thing without the requirement or the need to even try to comprehend it. So it allows us to go on with our lives and, as I said, categorize it, put it in a box. Jeffrey Dahmer is pure evil. Oh, okay, I get it. We don't need to think about it anymore. It's pure evil. Let it go. Now I can go on about my business and pay my bills and go to work and raise my kids, etc. So it shocks us, it unsettles us, it creates an imbalance in society that Emil Durkheim, the father of sociology, called anomie, which is like a chaotic state where things don't make sense, and we want to bring the world back in balance. How do we do it? We put reductionistic terms like evil, monster, vampire on these individuals, and now, okay, I feel better about things. But there's another contradictory thing happening there. And that is, I believe it's human nature, and you as a psychologist would probably be able to speak to this even better than me, that we're empathetic creatures, and there is an empathy. We're drawn. We try to identify with other things, even things that scare us, even things that are very frightening. So at the same time, we're repelled by John Wayne Gacy or Jeffrey Dahmer. There is this need to try to empathize with them. And if you think about it, the scariest monsters of all are the ones that really have human characteristics, human flaws, and that we can identify with in some way. The most, think of the Frankenstein monster. Is he an anti-hero? Is he a monster? Is he really a bad guy, or what? One of the reasons that I think Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde, that they've endured and are such iconic creatures, if you will, is that they're so human and so fragile in certain ways that we do empathize with them. So at the same time, we're repelled and we try to categorize them and put them in a box. There's another part of us that really is seeking some sort of empathetic understanding. And so the truly everyman serial killer, like a Ted Bundy, who could be your next door neighbor, he could be anyone. He seems so normal. He is both compelling and terrifying at the same time, because it means anyone could be a serial killer. Anyone. He's so handsome. He's so charming. He's so he seems like such a nice guy. So there's that empathy factor, but at the same time, in certain ways, it makes him even more scary, because that means anyone might be a serial killer, and that anyone might be a victim, maybe me, so in some ways, there are these contradictory forces at play there. But there's another part of the appeal, and that is just the visceral aspect of it. There's like this adrenaline jolt, When we're kids, we love roller coaster rides. I don't know about you, but I love to have the hell scared out of me at a haunted house, or at the on a roller coaster. You can't wait. You want to feel that adrenaline. You want to feel that fright. And monster movies, right? Monster movies do it too. Well, that doesn't go away. That addictive adrenaline rush that we love, that feeling, it doesn't go away when we're adults. So I argue, and have argued in my research and my book, that in many ways serial killers and true crime in general are for adults what the monster movies and roller coasters are for children. It provides this visceral adrenaline rush, and it's it is addictive, there's another, there's so many interesting aspects of this that I've uncovered through my research. People, they hate to say they love serial killers, but yet I've had so many people say to me, it's a guilty pleasure. Like, I can't really tell my husband about it. I really can't tell my friends about it, but I love it. I really, really love it, which is why I gave my book the ironic title that I did, Why We Love Serial Killers. Do we really love them? Well, yeah, there are people who say they do, they do. But more than anything else, it's this intense fascination, I believe that we have. And I've been criticized for this by people who perhaps they either don't see the irony of it, or the fact that it's a sociological perspective. And what I mean by this is, I actually, in my book, I say that serial killers serve a purpose, or in sociology we say a function. They're functional in some way. Doesn't mean they're good. I'm not saying that it's a good thing, but the function that they serve is they delineate sort of the outer boundary between man and monster. If you want to know where man ends and monster begins, look no further than Jeffrey Dahmer. Because after torture, mutilation, death, and cannibalism, what's left? What's left, right? So if Emile Durkheim, again, the father of sociology, was with us, he believed that every everyone and everything serves a purpose in society of some sort. It has a role to play. So if serial killers have a role to play, I would argue that it is this to create the outer boundary and delineate, the line between man and monster. And once again, once we set that boundary, it makes us feel safe that they are the other. The serial killer is the other. We are not. We are safe. We're okay. I may not be the best person in the world, but I'm sure is not as bad as Jeffrey Dahmer. The rest of us aren't so bad after all. So it serves that purpose, or that the function of making us in some ways feel better about ourselves.
Right. Beautiful breakdown. As I listen and interpret, if I could try to kind of extract my own kind of bullet points from that excellent explanation, you touched on this kind of inexhaustible mystery surrounding serial killers. It's just so endlessly fascinating. It's like, it seems like you can never fully understand it. And so that's part of the draw. And then you have, like you said, media kind of reducing it down and simplifying it, and not along with simple terms like evil, monster. You've talked about how they give these serial killers these kind of cutesy names, these nicknames like the Night Stalker and things like that. And I wonder if that's part of kind of reducing it down to a somewhat understandable depiction of the serial killer. And then there's the empathy piece, which is indeed very interesting. It's because there's empathy, of course, for the victims, but there's also, I know that's not what you were saying there. You were saying there's empathy for the serial killer. There's this natural impulse to want to identify and even take on the perspective and dip into the emotions that they may have been experiencing, which leads me to a question that I'll say in about 1 minute here. But so there's the mystery, there's the media depiction, kind of packaging it for you. There's the empathy element. There's the, what was the next thing you were saying? The next main point was
the functional aspect.
Functionality. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It gives people, right, no matter how imperfect I am, I'm not a monster. And I can clearly look at these people and say, yeah, they're monsters. I must be doing okay. So the question this leads me to, related to that and the empathy piece, is there a serial murderer in all of us? What's your view on that? Is there anything in us that we sense, however distantly, where there's the potential for us to become monsters?
That's a great question. In fact, I asked that question to none other than David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, in prison. I interviewed him in prison some years ago, and I asked that very same question. And his answer is, we're all capable of evil. We all have evil within us. And I have said in anger, I could just kill that guy. He cuts me off on the highway, or maybe it's a former boss who drove me crazy, and I felt that he didn't promote me when I should have been. I could kill that guy, right? Most of us have that anger, that moment of anger within us, that we just don't act upon because we have been properly socialized, and we have morality, and a sense of right and wrong, both instilled by society as well as mala in se, just natural. And so most of us, is that possibility there, and particularly in a situation where we are aroused or angered, and if there are inhibitors present like alcohol and or drugs, then it increases the likelihood. In fact, most violent felonies, not necessarily murders, but violent felonies, assaults, rape, as well as attempted homicide and homicide, occur when the individual is under some sort of drug or alcohol, about 75%. So those kind of inhibitors raise the stakes that something might happen. So yeah, if you align things properly or improperly in order to to increase the likelihood, yes, I think most of us have that capability. To be serial killers, no, because serial killers are not driven to kill for the reason that 99% of other killings occur. Most murders are not premeditated homicides, first-degree murder with deliberation and premeditation. They occur in a flash of rage. They are crimes of passion, where two people simply get into an argument, they get into a fight, and one of them ends up dead. There was no plan for that, but it happens. That's the vast majority of killings in the United States. Serial killers are very different. They don't kill out of rage. They don't kill out of an agitated state. They kill because it gives them great satisfaction to kill. It's more like I've used this analogy on a number of occasions, and I actually used it to David Berkowitz. He didn't like it very much, but I think it very much applies. They're closer to addicts, drug addicts, than they are to the motive for which most killings occur. And what I mean is, a serial killer has an itch, and that itch is the need to kill. Now, what causes that itch it could be different things. Sometimes it's out of a need to control and dominate other people, the ultimate control and domination. Sometimes it has a sexual aspect of it, sometimes both. Sometimes it's out of financial gain. There are many different motivations on why serial killers kill, but that once they have that itch, it never goes away. And it builds and builds and builds. And just like the mosquito bite that you have to scratch, they have to ultimately kill. And that the satisfaction that they get from that killing is very short-lived, and the itch comes back again, and it starts to itch once more, and it's just a matter of time before they've got to go and scratch it again and get another victim. Or liken it to a heroin addict who needs a fix, right? You get that high, but the high is very short-lived, and before you know it, you need the high again. It's in many ways closer to an addiction in my mind, in my criminological mind, than what would be the normal motivation for a killing.
Fascinating. Makes sense. Because again, yeah, like you said, 99% of murders are out of what social psychologists classify as hostile aggression, heat of the moment type of aggression, passion, crimes of passion, whereas serial killers are fundamentally different in that it's not driven by these fits of anger, but like you said, it's more like an addiction. It's much more premeditated and deliberate. There's a few things that are coming to my mind here that I'd like to ask you. So one is, I think of different contexts where a person might commit a series of killings, but wouldn't be classified as a serial killer, particularly in the context of war. And so I want to hear your thoughts on like the difference between the classic serial killer like Ted Bundy and the soldier who succeeds in killing 10 soldiers from the opposing army, and who is not, like, there are some parallels that I see here, but I would probably hesitate to classify that person as a serial killer. So can you talk, like, what are your thoughts on that, on the difference between these types of killings?
Sure. And just to put in another variety there, you might put in the professional hitman, the mob hitman, who is killing multiple individuals, but the motivations are very different. So, yeah, I mean, at the very basic level, one human being killing other human beings in separate events, not in one big fell swoop like a mass murder, but individually they have that in common. But the soldier is condoned by the state. You have the state's endorsement in doing it. You have your superior officer telling you that it is your duty, you're honor bound to do this, and it's all wrapped up in the flag and God. So it's very much rationalized, justified, and socially acceptable, where it's not socially acceptable for Jeffrey Dahmer to kill and eat people because he has lust for them. And also the motivations are very different. I'm sure that there are soldiers who do love to kill, and there may be some for whom that this is a wonderful outlet. Go to war because I want to kill people anyway. Now it's socially acceptable for me to do that, but I would have to think that is very much a minority, right, there. But there was a soldier, I forget his name now. When you asked me this question, it made me think of this. There was a guy, a soldier, who was in Iraq, and I believe also Afghanistan, and he had been trained to be a sniper, so he was highly trained, and he got sent over to Iraq, but instead of using him as a sniper, he ended up driving a truck around, and he felt very much unfulfilled and underutilized. That I'm this perfect weapon, I've been trained to be this perfect weapon, and you're not letting me do it. So what happened when his tour of duty was over? He came back to Los Angeles. He was very disgruntled, feeling that he had been improperly used. He became a serial killer of homeless men in Los Angeles, and began as a sniper, shooting homeless men. And that was his way, his outlet for utilizing the skills that he thought had been given to him but were improperly used. And in fact, that's a particular kind of serial killer. It's called a mission killer, and it's where a serial killer gives themselves their own mission. And in his case, it was to rid Los Angeles of homeless men. That's a value judgment that he made, but he believed that he was very much justified in doing what he did.
Interesting. This is a good segue then to the next question. So you talk about this itch that serial killers have, and so it's kind of the proverbial "are they born or made" question, which I'm sure you have fielded many times in your career and in your classrooms. So I would be curious to hear your perspective on this. What gives rise to that itch?
Yeah, it's a great question, and once again, it's not one size fits all. There are a lot of myths about serial killers out there, that they're much more prolific, and there are many more of them than there really are. We talked about that. There's another myth that they're all these sort of socially dysfunctional loners who live out in the woods, in a cabin by themselves, that they're all young white males, which is not true. That they're all, either insane or evil geniuses like Hannibal Lecter and Silence of the Lambs. These are all myths that just, none of them are true. Well, another one is that there are as many different varieties of serial killers and motivations as you can imagine, and the genesis of it, or what triggers it within these individuals, varies. The one one pattern that's been shown, and this exists among some of the most well-known, so like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis Rader, who called himself Bind, Torture, Kill, Richard Ramirez, John Wayne Gacy. So you've got some of the most, well-known serial killers who followed this phenomenon. And that is, somewhere around puberty, somewhere around the age of 12, 13, 14, two things got intertwined and confused: sexual urge and torture and torment. The enjoying hurting things. And so many of these individuals started with torturing animals, strangling cats, Jeffrey Dahmer talks about a fascination with dead animals. He would walk around in the woods and put his hands literally inside the body cavities of dead animals and become sexually aroused. Okay, so something very macabre and strange happens where at puberty, sex and this morbid fascination with death, torture, and harming things become intertwined. Richard, you mentioned Richard Ramirez before. His story is incredible. He had a cousin, an older cousin, who was in the Vietnam War. And his older cousin sounds like he was a sociopath himself, because he took pictures of himself and his friends in Vietnam torturing and raping girls. And he brought these photographs home and showed them to a young 12 or 13-year-old Richard Ramirez. And Richard says he remembers becoming sexually aroused looking at these photographs. Wow. And to take it a step further, Richard witnessed this older cousin kill his own wife, kill in front of him, and he became sexually aroused by that. So there is a very graphic example of it. Ted Bundy, the same thing. David Berkowitz, the same thing. He strangled animals. He strangled cats. He would hurt. He killed his grandparents' bird. So harming things and then having it become a sexual arousal. Now, at 13, 14, they don't suddenly walk out the door and become serial killers. But what happens is this fascination, and this is where the itch, the urge starts to take place. And over time, it builds and builds and builds. And there's a fantasy loop that begins to go with it. What would it be like to kill a woman? What would it be like to rape her? What would this be like? And they fantasize. And then ultimately, oftentimes in the early 20s, 22, 24, 25, something like that, they can no longer stand the urge, and they have to actually act it out. They have to experience it, and that's where they become a killer. And that first killing is oftentimes not easy. It's the most difficult one because they've been fantasizing about it now for 10 years. They don't have experience in doing it yet. Oftentimes they make mistakes. It's not an easy thing to do, but once they do it, they get a taste for it, so to speak, and it becomes easier and easier, and the drive becomes stronger and stronger. So this is one trajectory of a serial killer, in terms of where the origin starts and how they ultimately kill. But it's not the only one. There are individuals that seem to show no real signs in adolescence, and suddenly act out on it. Now, to your question of nature versus nurture, about at least 50% of serial killers that we're aware of, documented, at least 50% of them would be clinically psychopaths. They would classify as psychopaths. Now, for your viewers, what is a psychopath? A psychopath is an individual, and I'm going to use my terminology, who are essentially like unplugged. Imagine empathy is like an electrical cord in the wall, the same for your hair dryer. If you pull the plug out, the hair dryer doesn't work. Well, the same thing with the empathy cord. You pull it out of the wall, it doesn't work. So individuals like Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, Dennis Rader, they don't have empathy. They just don't feel it. So therefore, in people, they can hurt people, and it doesn't mean anything more to them than stepping on an ant. It just doesn't mean anything. Now, they are very able to feel sensations like sexual arousal, stimulation, adrenaline, euphoria, that they can feel, but they can't feel remorse, pity, normal human emotions, sadness, and etc., which is what enables them to kill so cold-bloodedly, and be able to sleep like babies afterwards. They tend to dehumanize, and they'll even refer to their victims never as victims, but as subjects or objects. Ted Bundy referred to them as objects, and Dennis Rader, the Torture Kill, referred to them as projects. So for him, it was like building a model airplane, killing someone. It's believed, many people believe that psychopathy is genetic, that it's inherited. A predisposition or a tendency towards psychopathy is inherited, and they've done mapping of the brain that shows that the impulses and brain activity works differently in the psychopathic brain than it does in the normal brain. So a good portion of serial killers are of the psychopath variety, and so many experts believe that they are born as opposed to necessarily made, but that's not to rule out the importance of nurture, and that your life events and your trajectory within your life, what you're exposed to, can increase the likelihood that trigger will occur during your adolescent years. So, for example, a guy like Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, there's a psychopath, and he was horribly tortured and tormented by his mother. His mother would burn him with cigarettes, and she would lock him in the dark in the basement with rats. I mean, she tortured him. Not surprisingly, he ended up hating his mother, grew up to hate his mother, and he killed a bunch of people before he ultimately killed his own mother. So his mother was the sort of the frosting on the cake, so to speak. He killed her last, but certainly, even though he may have been born with a predisposition genetically, his environment certainly contributed to making him who he was.
Great answer. Very clear. And maybe you can clarify. I know you've written about the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath, and I think many people have this question. So perhaps since we're on this subject, can you clarify that for our listeners? What's the difference?
Sure. And again, I'm going to try to, I am not a neuroscientist. By training, I'm a criminologist. It's trained sociologically. So I'm going to try to explain it in a way that I can understand it, and maybe it'll help others. So psychopaths are incapable of those normal feelings, those normal sensations of remorse and regret and pity and so forth. So that cord, the empathy plug in the wall, is just pulled out. They're not able to feel it. A sociopath, on the other hand, is capable of empathy and a range of emotions with certain individuals or things, dogs, cats, whatever, in certain circumstances, but not others. So I like to use the analogy, it's like there's a faulty cord, in the wall. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, okay? And sociopaths, as a result, tend to be much more volatile emotionally than psychopaths. Psychopaths are just cold-blooded. They're just flatlined. They're unflappable. Things don't bother them because they don't feel the normal range of emotions. Sociopaths do, but they're up and down, and they tend to be prone to bouts of rage and anger, but at the same time can be very cold and indifferent. So in sociopaths, there are more of them. There are probably 8 or 10 times as many sociopaths as there are psychopaths, but it's easier to see a sociopath coming. They have tells. They have things that you can pick up on, whereas a psychopath can just be absolutely unflappable. And a psychopath, oftentimes, they know very well how to mimic emotions. They can mimic emotions. They know what the right thing to say is. They know how they're supposed to respond. They just don't feel it. But because they're so cold-blooded and unflappable, it's harder to identify them, which makes them more dangerous. Ultimately, a psychopath is considered more dangerous than a sociopath, even though there's perhaps 8 or 10 times as many sociopaths as psychopaths. And it's also, back to your other question, it's commonly believed that sociopaths are more likely to be made as opposed to born, that one's environment contributes to one becoming a sociopath, which is why they do have a range of emotions. They're capable of maybe, for example, they have feelings toward animals, and they would never hurt an animal, but yet people, not so much. I can hurt people with no problem, but I would never hurt a dog or or a cat. That would be more of a sociopath.
Interesting. So you've kind of spoken to this a little bit, but I want to ask the question anyway. In all of your experience interviewing serial killers and investigating them, do they ever feel remorse? Is there ever a moment when they realize and actually feel the weight of what they've done?
Great question. And I'm going to refer the two that I know the best and have spent the most time researching and actually spent time with are David Berkowitz, who called himself Son of Sam, or was referred to as Son of Sam, and then Dennis Rader, who called himself Bind, Torture, Kill. Now, Dennis Rader he's been referred to by professionals as a malignant narcissist and psychopath. He is on the if there's a spectrum of psychopathy from high to low, he is on the highest end of psychopath. People simply mean nothing to him. Does he feel remorse? Does he express remorse? No. He in fact, he flips it around. He does what's called we call it in criminology a neutralization technique. He turns it around and says, God made me this way, so how dare you say to me that I'm doing something wrong? I'm a natural born predator, like a hawk or a shark. He actually refers to himself as a shark. He says, so I'm no different. Would you blame a great white shark for doing what it does? Well, then no. Then why would you blame me? I'm just doing God's will. I mean, talk about circular reasoning. So with someone as extreme as him, no, you're not gonna get a sense of remorse. John Wayne Gacy, who called the killer clown, dressed up like the clown in children's hospitals. And by the way, I think there's a Netflix documentary coming out on him pretty soon. He famously, his last words before being executed by lethal injection, they asked him if he had any last words. He said, "Yes, kiss my ass." So that was pretty much all he had to say about his sense of remorse. But and a lot of people, I've had some criticism about this one too. But it's my perspective on it. David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, is a horse of a different color, if you will. I do not believe that he is a psychopath. He has never been identified as a psychopath. I believe he was an extremely emotionally troubled youth and who was looking for meaning in his life, some kind of purpose, and he sought that purpose through Satanism. And he did come to believe, he had it all twisted in his mind, that if somehow he killed for Satan, that he would find the meaning and the purpose that he was looking for. He was not clinically mentally ill. He was not psychotic, schizophrenic. He didn't have psychotic episodes. He's not a psychopath. And as such, he has had, he's been in prison for more than 40 years now. He has experienced what he calls a spiritual awakening. He believes that, or he calls himself a born again Christian, and he no longer refers to himself as Son of Sam. He now calls himself the Son of Hope. And believe it or not, again, truth is stranger than fiction. He has been adopted by the evangelical Christian community and they've adopted him as almost like the poster boy of redemption. And there is a Christian website devoted to him, and the URL is ariseandshine.org, and it's received hundreds of thousands of hits all over the world by people who now find him as a source of inspiration for turning their own lives around. So David has become something of a jailhouse pastor, a minister, and he actually leads the congregation in prison in the chapel on Sundays, and he believes he's doing God's good work. Now, when I met him some years ago in upstate New York at the Sullivan County Correctional Facility, which is like a maximum security fortress up there in the Catskills, he literally wept with me over his victims and prayed for forgiveness with me. He insisted that I pray with him for forgiveness for his sins. Like I say, he's a born again Christian. I've had many people scoff at this, but I'll tell you that I believe that he believes it. Do I believe it? I'm not sure. If he's acting, then he's the Daniel Day-Lewis of serial killer actors, because he's quite convincing, even with his tears in prison 40 years later. But I believe that he believes it. And there are those who believe and say that he has done so much to help. He writes to cancer patients all over the world. He does all sorts of things, trying to make amends. And my feeling is he's never going anywhere. He's going to die there in Sullivan Correctional Facility. And if his letters and his ministry help some people, why not? Let him do it.
Yeah.
So he expresses tremendous remorse for his sins.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
You wouldn't, I imagine you wouldn't trust this transformation enough to vote for him to be set free? No.
And he didn't like that either. I mean, I'll accept him at face value, and he's doing this, good work, helping. He does all sorts of things in prison. Not only is he like a spiritual advisor and spiritual guide for other patients. They're all lifers where he is at Sullivan Correctional Facility. Many of them have physical impairments and other impairments. So he's the mobility guide. He helps them go to the cafeteria. He does all kinds of things. And then like I said, he's got this sort of jailhouse ministry, his website, where he's helping people, cancer patients, people who have been searching for meaning in their own lives. They say that his words comfort them, and so forth. So let him do it. But no, I would never suggest letting him out in society. I think he's given up the right, by all the people that he's harmed. In addition to those that he killed, I mean, there are victims out there who are paralyzed for life, and I think he's given up his right to be out in society.
Yes. Earlier when I was kind of extracting the bullet points of one of your answers, one that I realized I missed there was the sheer adrenaline rush of hearing about these stories or watching depictions of it in movies and shows. Mm-hmm. So I want to touch on that again for a moment, and to kind of make sure I return to the central theme of the conversation of why do we love and why are we so fascinated by these serial killers. So I think so many people listening right now can relate to the way we almost can't look away from gory scenes, these horrifying depictions of violence. And in this ironic way, it makes us feel very alive. These adrenaline rushes are highly sought after. And so I understand that element behind the attraction to it. Do you think there's anything along the lines of this satisfaction of a dark fantasy, mm-hmm. or this sublimation of unconscious desires, or anything along those lines? Do you see any merit to that idea?
Yeah, no, I do. I think they appeal to very primal sensations, the need for survival, fear. Serial killers tap into that. So at one level, it allows us to experience our darkest fears and our worst horrors, but in a safe environment within the context of a Netflix documentary or a book or a feature film. So we can be close to the flame, but we don't get burned, right? We can look into the abyss, but we don't fall in. So many of us, we want to be able to do that. We want to do it, but here, through reading about Jeffrey Dahmer, we can experience it, and it's in a very safe environment. And I do think that there are many of us wonder, what am I capable of under certain circumstances? Could I do that? Would I be capable of doing that? So there is that aspect to the fascination as well. And that gets to things that a lot of us don't even like to, think about or talk about. It's not the kind of thing you talk about at a cocktail party. Gee, I'm wondering if I'm capable of being a serial killer. It's not the kind of thing you just sort of chit chat about. And yet, that exists. It exists, within us. And I think it allows us to explore that once again in a safe way, in a safe environment. There's another thing that, and this gets to a broader idea of true crime, why true crime is so popular for people is, and serial killers, again, are a sort of a subsegment of that, a microcosm of it, is it's like a morality play, right? We love these true crime shows because we know at the end justice is going to prevail, everyone's safe, and we can go back to normal again. The typical pattern of a true crime show is it starts out with this horrible, this ghastly murder. Who done it? They take you off into the woods and scare the hell out of you. All back and forth, all around. Finally, you find out who did it. They stand trial and they go to prison, and justice prevails. I feel safe. I feel safe, right? And if you think about the world that we live in now, that is more divisive and frightening and uncertain than ever, politically, racially, religious-wise, everything that we can think of is in disarray and debate right now. These little morality plays provide us with a sense of control in an otherwise uncontrollable world. For the next 60 minutes, I can watch 48 Hours, or I can watch 2020, or I can watch something on ID or Oxygen, and I can get the hell scared out of me, but I know at the end, justice will prevail and I'm going to feel safe.
And often it's like, I feel safe, and I knew it was him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the one. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's the one thing that we didn't really talk about is that at another level, it's like everyone as a kid, loves the game Clue. Trying to figure out, Colonel Mustard did it with the candlestick in the in the library or whatever. We all love to play armchair detective. Who done it? Well, these stories allow it, because oftentimes either the perpetrator is unknown, disappears, like in the case of the Zodiac, or the Boston Strangler, or others, or Jack the Ripper, and it becomes a legendary whodunit story for which there is no ending. So it allows us to debate and play detective and see if we ourselves can figure out the crime, and that also just contributes to the the sort of enjoyment factor, the entertainment factor of it. And one other thing that brings to my mind is the entertainment media and news media both do this. They tend to blur fact and fiction. This is the 30th anniversary this year of the release of Silence of the Lambs with Hannibal Lecter, the iconic serial killer, and Anthony Hopkins. That movie was released in January of 1991. That summer, Jeffrey Dahmer was exposed and apprehended. If you go back and you look at the media of that time, there was a blurring of fact and fiction. Jeffrey Dahmer, on the page of front cover of People magazine became the real life Hannibal Lecter. And there was this blurring of reality, fact and fiction. And what that does, I believe, is it desensitizes people. It turns these individuals like Jeffrey Dahmer, once again, into these celebrity monsters that receive more than their due share of publicity, exposure, and promotion. And at the expense of the victims, everybody knows Jeffrey Dahmer's name. Who knows the name of any one of the 17 men that he killed, or Ted Bundy and the 36 women that he killed? No one knows. They become Mount Rushmore, serial killers, but no one knows their victims, does the victims injustice, blurs fact and fiction, and it turns these real life killers into just what I call popcorn entertainment. How different is Hannibal Lecter? If you're watching TV at home and it's a segment on Jeffrey Dahmer, or you're watching Silence of the Lambs, how different is it really as an entertainment commodity until Jeffrey Dahmer shows up at the front door? Then it's different. Right. But until then, it's just entertainment.
Such a great point. Do you think that it's morally wrong, or do you think it's morally neutral that these huge companies, media companies, deliberately blur fact and fiction and deliberately manufacture this larger than life perception of these killers?
Yeah, profits, capitalism, right? And especially in this age of 24/7 ubiquitous media content, everyone is vying for attention, right? And many of them are covering the same stories. Well, the only way to get them to turn into your story about a serial killer is to be more sensationalized, scream louder than the next guy, right? So the very nature of the marketplace almost lends itself to this feeding frenzy of sensationalism. Back in the days when there were just a couple of network TV channels, ABC, NBC, CBS, there was Time Magazine, Look Magazine, Reader's Digest. You didn't have the same, kind of feeding frenzy that you have going on now. So do I think that there is do I think that by sensationalizing it, is that immoral to exploit the victims, to deliberately try to capitalize and sensationalize these individuals? Yes. Is it illegal? No. Does the marketplace facilitate it? Yes. So it's not likely to change. It's just not likely to change. And again, because the public has this fascination and is used to these images, if you will, of monster, evil. We've trained the audience, to buy into these roles, these identities. They accept it, readily, very readily. It's not like they have to be force fed. These overly reductionistic, stereotypical images already exist in the pop culture. Right. So when a new one comes along, it's just like connect the dots, painting by numbers. The template's already there.
Yeah, fascinating. There's one more question I want to ask you, which is, you talked about the functionality of serial killers in society. I see that clearly. Do you think that there's an inevitability of serial killers? Is this always going to be part of human behavior?
Two thoughts come to mind. Again, I'm trained in sociology, so if Emil Durkheim was here, he would say yes, crime and serial killing as a subset it's a social fact. It's inevitable, and so we should just expect it. And uh, because it is driven by individualized fantasy needs as opposed to something that we construct as a society. We can contribute to it. We can fan the flames of it. But I think the pilot light is there to begin with. You know, the pilot light was already in Jeffrey Dahmer. It was already in Ted Bundy. It was already in John Wayne Gacy. As a society, we may have fanned those flames, but it was already there. And because these individuals are not killing out of any sense of retaliation or anger or retribution, they're killing out of this innate hunger. That would suggest that as long as, you know, these hungers exist, that, you know, unfortunately, serial killers will probably exist too.
It's a harsh, you know, thing to realize and come to terms with, but I am convinced by that. And what seems very frustrating to me is that I don't see a way to effectively deter someone with that itch from acting out on it. It doesn't, like, they don't care about going to jail, seemingly. They don't care about their social reputation. They don't care that everyone's going to hate them, even though they're fascinated with them. So do you see, like, is there anything that can deter someone who's kind of starting to succumb to that?
It's I think that the best solution, and one that is actually is working today, is from the outside, not from the standpoint of it's, you know, if an individual has improper wiring at birth, there's not much you can do about that improper wiring. But what you can do, and what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years, the serial killing incidents reached their peak, and the number of serial killers and serial killing incidents reached their peak in the 1980s, actually, and it's been declining since then. That's good news. And what do I attribute that to? Partially public awareness. The public is more vigilant now about protection, in more homes with security systems, less people hitchhiking than they did back in the 50s and 60s and even 70s. So people are more vigilant, and law enforcement has much better techniques now. They understand serial killers much better since the 1980s because of things like DNA. They can connect the dots much more easily. And so one of the things that I think is happening is that serial killers are being stopped after, say, one murder before they actually become serial killers. Right. So I think we're getting better at detecting them, not necessarily better at preventing them in the first place, because, again, if it's genetic, you're not going to really be able to do that. But we as a society are getting better at detecting them and protecting ourselves from them and catching them.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, just to give you some numbers, I get asked this a lot. You know, at any given time, how many serial killers are there operating in the United States? Probably at any given time, as few as a couple of dozen to as many as 40 or 50 operating at any given time in the United States. On the other hand, in the 1980s, it was probably 600 to 800.
Wow.
So it was much greater number in the 1970s and 1980s. Yeah.
Wow, that's some perspective, and even more encouraging than I initially thought. Wow. Okay. Well, I you know, don't necessarily assume that anyone who is like any of the law enforcement or anyone who's responsible for this decline is listening. But if so, thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I also want to say, if by any chance anyone is listening whose life has been affected by a serial killer, you have my deepest compassion, and I know your pain is unfathomable to anyone who hasn't experienced it. And I'm aware that, two of us are sitting here speaking about this topic in an analytical manner, and we're, emotionally removed from it in this moment. But I know the weight of what we're talking about, and I know that there are people who, again, whose lives have been completely devastated because of these people. So I just want to acknowledge that and express my compassion.
Absolutely. And I would say not only for the survivors and the families of the victims, but for the families of the killers themselves, because they are, they're victims too. And many of them, their lives are destroyed as a result of finding out that their brother or their father is a notorious serial killer.
Right. Right. Well, this is another moment where I feel like we could really go on for much longer, and perhaps in the future you might be willing to come back for a part 2 of this conversation.
Sure.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate your insight here. I mean, you're a wealth of knowledge on the topic. You're so organized in your thoughts, and then the way you talk about it. It's just so lucid, and I really appreciate that. And I'm sure everyone listening now also appreciates it. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I absolutely be happy to come back again sometime.
Beautiful. Well then, I think that'll happen. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for looking squarely into the face of one of the darkest human tendencies and shedding light on the psychology and the sociology behind it. I think that's brave and important. So thank you for that too.
Thank you so much. It's been great, and wish you and the audience a blessed day as well.
Beautiful. Okay, until we meet again.
If you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe.